A dangerous storm front will sweep through the U.S. midsection over the weekend with large hail, damaging winds, and torrential rainfall that will leave behind the threat of flooding throughout the region. That's the warning from the National Weather Service. On Friday night, thunderstorms had already blown through several communities in the Southwest. The National Weather Service said it took down trees and power lines, while a reported rain-wrapped tornado in Lawrence, Illinois, destroyed a structure, damaged a house, and caused power outages.
A U.S. official said North Korea's tested what probably was a medium-range ballistic missile. The official says the missile broke up a couple of minutes after launch and the pieces fell into the Sea of Japan. South Korea's foreign minister warned if the international community does not respond to North Korea's repeated provocations now, that they will only further feed the appetite of the trigger-happy regime in Pyongyang. Yoon Byung-se told the UN Security Council that it should take additional punitive measures before North Korea launches more ballistic missiles, and not afterward.
On Saturday, at a Brussels summit, European Union leaders have endorsed stiff divorce terms for Britain. The EU warned Britons to have no illusions about securing a new relationship to keep their access to EU markets. Officials accused London of vetoing some EU spending and demanded it back down, or face disrupting the start of talks next month. EU leaders also ruled out the discussion of a free trade deal that Britain wants until they see significant progress on key withdrawal terms. Summit Chair Donald Tusk told reporters that before discussing the future, we have to sort out our past.
According to data obtained by BuzzFeed News, half of the 683 immigrants arrested in raids after Trump took office had no criminal convictions or had only traffic violations as their most serious crimes. 2 people arrested had convicted homicide, 18 had assault records, and 8 had rape or sexual assault records. Nationwide raids that occurred shortly after Trump took office sent chills through the immigrant community nationwide. The raids took place in cities such as Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Atlanta.
On a Thursday, Ramallah's shopping streets would normally be buzzing with preparations for the weekend. Instead, shops, businesses, schools, everything except emergency services were shut down by the first general strike in the occupied West Bank for more than a decade. It was called by the main political faction Fatah in solidarity with around 1,500 Palestinian prisoners on hunger strike in Israeli jails. Iman Nafe's husband is serving a life sentence for killing an Israeli officer in 1978. She says she can only see him twice a year.
These people, they are suffering from food strike now. For us, for me to go and visit my husband, to see him, to at least to feel that I am human when I see him.
The hunger strike is being led by Marwan Barghouti, the Fatah leader imprisoned since his conviction in 2004 for planning attacks in which Israelis were killed. Israeli media are calling the strike a political gambit ahead of Palestinian elections next month. The message on the streets is different.
6,500 Palestinians are currently in Israeli jails. It's an issue which touches directly many families here, and they say that the treatment that they suffer in those jails is something that needs to be protested against, something that needs to be changed.
They say as well as irregular family visits, inmates receive poor health care and are mistreated during prison transfers. The Israeli Prison Service says the hunger strike is a violation of discipline, which endangers health and life. It says it will provide the strikers with medical care, but does not negotiate.
Friday, April 28th, former President George H.W. Bush was released from the hospital in Houston, Texas. He was being treated for chronic bronchitis and pneumonia. Bush is currently 92 years old, and he's happy to be out of the hospital. His spokesman, Jim McGrath, told the press, "President and Mrs. Bush are very pleased to be home spending time with family and friends and are grateful for the outstanding care provided by his doctors and nurses."
Thousands of people across the U.S. are marking President Donald Trump's 100th day in office by marching in protest of his environmental policies. Organizers say that 300 other protest marches are expected around the country. Participants in the People's Climate March say they're objecting to Trump's rollback of restrictions on mining, oil drilling, and greenhouse gas emissions at coal-fired power plants, among other things. In Augusta, Maine, protesters outside the State House said they wanted to draw attention to the damage climate change can cause marginalized communities.
In March, North Korea proudly showed the world a successful multiple missile launch. Saturday morning's test was called a failure by the US and South Korea after the missile flew for just a few minutes. But it was another clear message from Pyongyang that it has no plans to stop its missile program. There was an immediate reaction from South Korea and Japan.
The government sternly warns North Korea if it continues playing with fire like this, it will face strong punitive measures on various levels, including the UN Security Council.
Supposing it was a ballistic missile firing, it is a clear violation of the UN Security Council resolution, and we cannot accept the repeated provocation by North Korea. We lodged a strong protest against North Korea.
North Korea likes to time provocative acts with significant events. This was no different. The launch came just hours after a meeting of the UN Security Council, where the United States called for unity in tightening sanctions against Pyongyang.
This is the way you make your voice heard, is through action. Any failure to take action diminishes your vote for these resolutions of the past. It diminishes your vote for future resolutions, and it devalues your seat at this council.
The US wants North Korea's ally China to use its influence and economic relationship to bring Pyongyang into line. China wants the United States to halt its military buildup and to cancel an anti-missile system it's installing in South Korea, which China views as a threat.
On Saturday, hundreds of Russians have lined up in central Moscow to hand over handwritten appeals for President Vladimir Putin to quit as part of a protest taking place in several cities in Russia. Putin, who has dominated Russian politics for 17 years, has not said whether he will run in presidential elections in March 2018, but is widely expected to do so. Saturday's protest in the capital, called "We're Sick of Him," was organized by the Open Russia movement. On Saturday's peaceful protest, one out of the hundreds of protesters would make their way through police and hand over their petitions one by one. She said nothing positive has happened in our country on his watch, and I have the sense that things are getting worse.
This is a visit promoting peace, but it's been beset by the fear of further attacks on Christians. Egypt's Republican guards, policemen, and the Pope's own security personnel were extra vigilant as the pontiff traveled to a military stadium in Cairo. 2 churches were bombed 3 weeks ago, and ISIL has threatened more attacks. That didn't dissuade supporters wanting to see Pope Francis. Setting aside religious differences, they shared prayers and the ritual of Mass, while the Pope reminded them and anyone else listening of their shared humanity.
It is of no use to pray if our prayer to God does not turn into love for our brothers and sisters. All our religiosity means nothing unless it is inspired by deep faith and charity. It is of no use to be concerned about our image, since God looks at the soul and the heart and detests hypocrisy.
Catholics in Egypt make up less than 1% of the Muslim majority population. This trip, organized by Muslim leader Sheikh Ahmed Al-Tayeb, was planned before the recent attacks on Coptic churches.
Pope Francis arrived in Cairo, Egypt on Friday in hopes of mending ties with Muslim leaders. Egypt's Christian community has recently faced unprecedented pressure by Islamic State militants who have threatened to wipe them out. This week, Islamic State suicide bombers killed 45 people in 2 church bombings in the Egyptian cities of Tanta and Alexandria. Earlier this week, Pope Francis gave a speech expressing his hope that his visit would help bring peace and encourage dialogue with the Islamic world.
Just 3 kilometers from the border, there's a restaurant which caters to local farmers and curious tourists. This is how Mr. Lee and his wife are spending their retirement after working 20 years in the United States. The restaurant opened in 1995, so the Lees say they're used to the tensions with North Korea. But this time there is another issue.
Since Trump became president, a very different atmosphere has been created compared to that of the Democrats. Quite aggressive. Just like everyone else here, I do feel a little worried.
Nearby, at the northernmost point you can travel without government permission, is the Imjingak Tourist Park. You can walk on the bridge where nearly 13,000 prisoners of war were traded at the end of the Korean War in 1953. A train bearing the ravages of the conflict is on show. The steam locomotive was attacked on its way to Pyongyang in the area now known as the demilitarized zone. It stands as a symbol of hope that one day it will finish its journey.
I feel sad. I can see North Korea from here with my own eyes, but I can't go there.
I don't think North Korea is a huge threat, but unification will be difficult. And even when my daughter's all grown up, I feel the relationship with the North will be the same.
In the capital, Seoul, about 56 kilometers south of the border, preparations for the Lantern Festival coincide with news of another North Korean failed missile launch.
On Saturday, CNN reports that 21 kids who have voiced their concerns about climate change are taking President Donald Trump and his administration to federal court over inaction on global warming. On Saturday, the kids have said that they will walk alongside adults at the March for Climate, Jobs, and Justice in Washington. That demonstration is a call for a clean energy revolution, and it's expected to draw a crowd of thousands of people. The climate kids are arguing on constitutional grounds that their rights to life, liberty, and property are being violated by runaway climate change.
In April, the UK's Transport Research Laboratory, or TRL, completed its first test of an autonomous shuttle in Greenwich, a part of Greater London. A prototype driverless shuttle carried commuters through a 2 km route around the Greenwich Peninsula using autonomy technology and built-in sensors to avoid obstacles. Professor Nick Reed said, "There's a philosophical difference between Google's 2-passenger cars and putting lots of people on a single bus." Reed, a technical lead on the Gateway project, is working on the driverless shuttle trials.
On Donald Trump's 100th day in office, thousands of climate activists gathered on Washington, D.C. They wanted to send Trump the message that climate change is real. Demonstrators marched down Pennsylvania Avenue Saturday, chanting, "Keep it in the soil, can't drink oil, and water is life." The demonstration convened under the banner of the People's Climate March. Participants surrounded the White House complex and staged a sit-in. Trump was in residence at the time. The Sierra Club helped organize the event. Celebrities such as Leonardo DiCaprio and Al Gore were in attendance.
It's reported by the Japanese broadcaster NHK that USS Carl Vinson Strike Group has sailed off the coast of Japan towards waters of the Korean Peninsula. The deployment comes just hours after the DPRK's failed ballistic missile launch. U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson warned the UN Security Council that failure to curb the DPRK's accelerated nuclear program could lead to catastrophic consequences. The presence of the U.S. strike group, as well as the joint military drills of the U.S. and South Korea, are said to be a show of force towards the DPRK.
The UN Security Council was not supposed to take any new actions against North Korea on Friday, but U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who chaired Friday's debate, said Pyongyang should face new sanctions and political isolation, as well as the threat of military action for developing nuclear weapons. Tillerson then told the Security Council that doing nothing was unacceptable.
This is the way you make your voice heard, is through action. Any failure to take action diminishes your vote for these resolutions of the past. It diminishes your vote for future resolutions, and it devalues your seat at this council.
The North Korea debate was always on the council's schedule for April, but increasingly belligerent behavior from the government of Kim Jong-un in recent weeks gave Friday's session a new sense of urgency. Diplomats agreed that going to war should be avoided. The Chinese foreign minister told reporters that Beijing, Pyongyang's closest ally, is putting more pressure on the North. But during the council debate, Wang Yi said the U.S. needs to change its behavior too, including stopping joint military exercises with South Korea and removing a controversial missile defense system being deployed near Seoul.
It is detrimental to achieving denuclearization and to maintaining long-term stability on the peninsula. China once again urges relevant parties to immediately stop the deployment process.
The South Korean foreign minister's response to Wang shows just how hard it will be to get the parties to compromise.
It is purely a defensive measure in the face of such existential threat from North Korea. It's not aiming at any third country.
And the Russians, who have raised what some diplomats called surprising opposition to holding Pyongyang accountable, also pushed back at the U.S.'s promise to keep, quote, all options on the table.
Options of using force are completely unacceptable and can lead to catastrophic consequences to the Korean Peninsula and to the region of Northeast Asia as a whole.
In recent days, Al Jazeera understands that diplomats have been acting as go-betweens, trying to help the U.S. and North Korea resolve the crisis and save face. But let's be clear, there's no such thing as direct talks or a regional peace deal in the works, at least not yet. Rosalind Jordan, Al Jazeera at the United Nations.
Leopoldo Lopez has been in jail for 14 months. He's serving almost 14 years after being found guilty of inciting violence during anti-government protests in 2014. He's also a Venezuelan opposition leader. His supporters say the charges have been fabricated by the Maduro government. They say Lopez is a political prisoner. On Friday, crowds marched with his wife to Ramo Verde military prison outside the capital Caracas, demanding his release.
They took our identification cards and told us we couldn't see Leopoldo. They didn't even look at our identification cards. They told us he's in isolation and that we cannot visit. It has been a month since we have heard anything from Leopoldo. His lawyers are not being allowed to see him. Leopoldo has been held by the regime of Nicolas Maduro, by the military.
Protests like this have been going on for nearly a month across Venezuela, where inflation is skyrocketing and basic goods are hard to find. President Nicolas Maduro blames capitalism by foreign countries. Critics say Maduro's government is responsible for the crisis and for the deaths of more than 24 people killed during anti-government demonstrations.
Yelmi Adaibaidu belongs to the Bari indigenous group in Venezuela. He's 8 years old. His mother Yoleida says he fell from a motorcycle 1 year ago and suffered severe injuries. She brought him to Colombia to save his foot.
I took him to a hospital in Venezuela, and they told me they had to amputate his foot because they didn't have the medicines to treat him. They didn't have anything, so they wanted to cut off his foot.
In the city of San Cristobal, 1 hour away from the border, radiology equipment in the city's main hospital is broken. There are over 100 patients who urgently need it. There is also a waiting list of 300 people whose cancer treatments have been either put on hold or are not receiving all the medications they need. Marisol Montilla says she is desperate, and that's why she's trying to get help in Colombia. Her mother needs urgent treatment.
My mother has cancer in the esophagus, and she has no other option than chemotherapy and radiotherapy. Just like my mother, there are lots of people who are now abandoned and were literally told to find help somewhere else.
Lack of medicines is forcing people here to resort to desperate measures. This radio station, for example, has set up a medicine bank so people can donate the medication they don't use. Aurelia Contreras says it's been a big success.
Anyone here can call and people want to help out, and we can request a specific medicine and they use the radio to ask them. The medicines that are needed the most these days are the ones for high blood pressure and cancer.
And that's why many Venezuelans end up seeking help in neighboring Colombia.
On strike, banks in towns and cities across Brazil, public transport and schools, both public and some private, factories and more. Some major roads were also blocked. Brazil wasn't brought to a complete standstill, but the point was made. Workers are unhappy with President Michel Temer's labour and pension reforms. The trade unions say the reforms will erode workers' rights and put more power in the hands of the bosses.
This demonstration shows our dissatisfaction with the government. It shows the sadness of the people who live in a precarious way. We want a different society. We want a new era.
Having people on the streets demonstrating against the president's austerity measures will make them change their minds and get us a legitimate government.
Similar demonstrations took place across Brazil, accompanied by heavy security. with clashes in some cities, including Rio de Janeiro and Santos.
The government says that the pension and labour reforms are vital to lift Brazil out of recession, that many of the laws date back to the 1940s, but the country needs to modernise and make it more attractive to investment. Some here would agree with that sentiment, but not in the way that it's being implemented.
President Temer said he deplored political protests against his austerity measures that stopped workers getting to their jobs, and lamented the isolated incidents of violence. These protesters marched to President Temer's private residence in Sao Paulo, heavily guarded while he's in the capital Brasilia, overseeing the progress of his reforms through Congress. The deep divisions in Brazilian society glaringly apparent and increasingly polarized. Daniel Schweimer, Al Jazeera, Sao Paulo.